Well, look what we have here. How long I have been waiting to encounter such a fascinating specimen. My understanding is you've had periodic blackouts since, when was it? Ah, yes, early adolescence. Ever wonder what happens during those blackouts? Would you say you have visions of bloodshed? Yes, surely there is bloodshed.
Released in 2004, The Suffering is an action survival horror game developed by Surreal Software and published by Midway Games. In the early 2000s, the horror genre of games seemed to be booming from titles like Fatal Frame 2, Manhunt, Resident Evil 4, and The Thing. The early 2000s, for me personally, was a great time for gaming, loving horror games.
Come on, I got plenty for everybody. Doc's got it.
But one thing was for certain, as these games came out, a trend was emerging that the horror element of these titles began to lean more on the action crutch than ever before.
You're out of your league here, Blake.
Yeah, take it, bitch! Oh!
One title that seemed to fade into obscurity, unlike its horror brethren of that era, was The Suffering. The Suffering was one of those games that was hard to describe. While its horror elements were certainly there, the action side definitely seemed to take a stronger hold in the latter half of the game.
It's bloody anarchy here, and Luther's lost his soul.
Merry Christmas, filthy animal. And a Happy New Year.
The plot of the game is you play as a death row inmate, Torque, who aside from having an awesome name, claims to have blacked out his crime he was convicted of. Torque is certain he is innocent, but doesn't have much time to reflect on this, because the island the prison is on is hit with a massive earthquake, and seemingly all hell breaks loose.
Inmate, back in your cell. Everything's under control.
Now that Torque is free, he must escape off this island of death with not only his life, but his sanity, as he attempts to piece together his shattered memory of what truly happened the night of his crimes. While this plot seems thinly veiled, what actually takes place as you progress through the game is a much more involved and dark story that one can appreciate. The mechanics of the game are mainly action-oriented, with horror elements sprinkled in. With the game's morality system, it was one of the first times I played a game where it offered a choice scenario that seemed to give my decisions meaning as I progressed. Unlike other games where decisions were mainly directional focused, such as Resident Evil 3 or Parasite Eve 2.
Hold it right there, or I will cut you down. You hear me, inmate? Do you hear me?
Give him a chance.
Ah, to hell with protocol. Everything's gone to shit. Right now, I'd prefer a murdering scumfuck from the road to one of those monstrosities. We got a better chance of survival if we stick together. But you will do exactly what I say, or I will punch a hole in your sorry ass. Got it?
Calm down. Fuck him. Don't let your should
When I've seen these bastards spawn, I prefer to stay in the dark. Go get a flashlight from the break room down the hall. And no funny stuff.
I give major kudos to the Suffering because the development team knew that having scary monsters and gore wasn't enough to make the game fun and immersive, so they added subtle real-world elements. It takes some of America's darkest topics in history and shows the disturbing nature of prison life, slavery, racism, unethical experimentation, and the death penalty.
Hey, you. Yeah, you. Neighbor. Nice to meet you. My name's Floyd. How long you got to get turned on the table, huh? You all out of appeals? Your lawyer fuck you? I read about your trial. They got no witnesses, all circumstantial evidence. No one knows what really happened but you. But you can't remember a thing, is that right?
Best not to listen to him talk. Floyd's a degenerate parasite. They should have slapped the cuffs on him coming out of his mama's...
At least I know Jesus is with me, man. Whatever I've done, the Reverend says Jesus has forgiven me.
Will you shut the fuck up, you baby-raping, sodomizing sack of shit?
I was just asking the man a question, Goose. Whoa!
While the game is linear, it masks it well by making level environments big and gives the player freedom to explore varying areas if they choose. The prison, for example, feels like you're exploring a real-life institution, floor by floor. Adding to the game's immersion, nearly everything you see is interactable, from the cameras, lockers, and even the toilets. Something I found interesting as the developers were searching for inspiration in the game's early development, they turned to horror film, and to my surprise, they chose my favorite film of all time, Stanley Kubrick's The Shining.
Yes.
You've got a big surprise coming to you. You're not going anywhere. Go check out the snowcat in the radio and you'll see what I mean. Go check it out. Go check it out. Go check it out.
I think early on, the team would talk about what we found compelling in the horror genre, and far and away, The Shining was the movie that stood out for everyone as something that was uniquely horrific, yet not cheesy or ridiculous at the same time. It's a serious piece that is also intensely frightening. So we really wanted to create that same feeling of you're walking through an environment and then you're seeing visions of things that are, you don't maybe understand right away, but over the course of the whole game, come to create a sort of a full picture of one man's tortured soul and the horrible historic events that have taken place on this island.
The design in the enemies is where the game really shines. Once the development team had a basic structure of how they wanted the creatures to look and act, they sent the ideas off to Hollywood legend effects artist Stan Winston.
I've been creating creatures and characters for film for the past 30 years. From the dinosaurs in Jurassic Park, the Terminator, the entire Terminator series, the Predator, the Queen Alien in Aliens, Edward Scissorhands. This studio has, in fact, created more iconic characters in this genre than anywhere else in the world. I was approached by Midway about being involved with The Suffering. It was a slam dunk, of course. And the important thing for me is that this video game is scary, and that these creatures are unsettling, and that they're beyond what you've seen.
While having multiple endings in games seems to be normal for today's standards, it was a rare thing to see in games in this era. And The Suffering pulls it off with flying colors. having 3 different endings, all based off the player's choices in the game: good, neutral, and evil. This is where the replayability and getting your money's worth as a gamer was huge. Unlike today, where the model seems to be nickel and dime the player to death, or just not have a campaign at all.
Hey you! You know what the hell's going on? I saw a fire in the distance, but I couldn't raise no one on the radio. Hey, what are you doing? No!
On a scale of 1 to 10, I give The Suffering an 8. The game, while seemingly lost in time, is still a great title during the PS2 and OG Xbox era. Its attempt to take a basic horror title and give it themes to make the players think and challenge their morals was outstanding. What hinders the game is while action is a fun element, it can definitely feel like a grind midway through. No pun intended.
Bugs! 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 You bastards!
Creatures of the game are impressive, but also very saturated during action-heavy levels, so you find yourself fighting multiple copies of the same enemy over and over again. The developers claim that there was more action in the game than horror because it meant we were going to focus more on combat and avoid the long cutscenes, frail central characters, clumsy controls, fixed camera angles, and sparse ammo of many console horror games. But I personally say less is more, so if the game had less padding as far as its action shootouts, it may have made the game more appealing to replay. While The Suffering doesn't look like much as far as today's graphical standards, at the time this was very much on a AAA level as far as character models and voice acting.
Where the fuck are you? What's taking so long? Do it. Fucking do it! Just fucking kill me!
Lastly, it cannot go without saying the soundtrack for the game is outstanding. The tracks of the game touch on every nerve they attempt to hit. Pulse, action, pumping, induced horror the whole way through.
The time has come to wash the scum from the earth. This is my Armageddon. Lock it down.
Objects that were made of various elements: stone, steel, things that had long tones. We were using aluminum rods that were 10 and 12 feet long and getting them to resonate lengthwise. We were then striking them and getting them to resonate horizontally. Just about anything we could think of to create sonic signatures that were not typically used in game soundtracks.
A sequel to The Suffering was released in 2005 and was almost as good as its predecessor. Another fun fact, in 2005, Midway and MTV Films announced there was going to be a film adaptation of both games, and Stan Winston agreed to work on the project. But, as of today, Midway's closed its doors in 2010, and Stan Winston passed away in 2008, so I think it's safe to assume these films will never see the light of day. Which may or may not be a good thing, seeing how other horror film game franchises have been treated as films. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit the like button, and for more content like this, subscribe.
Even the strongest will is not enough to hold back the demons begins inside. The suffering